As the slide says, my name is John Disley and I'm head of transport policy now at Oxfordshire County Council. I mean, just first off, a couple of things. It is great to be here. One of the things that we'll touch on in the slides is some of the engagement and consultation we've tried to do with some of our work. This is another thing that we've never done before, a different way of engaging people with transport. Why wouldn't we want to take up this sort of opportunity? So I think it's really good to be here. Also pick up another point that Paul mentioned, and we might get into this a bit as well. He talked about differing views. We've got some tensions, we've got some trade-offs with transport at the moment. Some of them are very well live and documented, and we shouldn't be afraid of talking about those. It's real life, it's real world, and we'll hopefully get into a little bit of that as well. Okay, just kicking off, when I went to review the slides for this morning's session, I realised I didn't have a title, so I thought I'd better give it one. And I chose behind the acronyms because at local authorities and elsewhere we tend to get a bit behind ourselves with acronyms, and hopefully there won't be any of those that I don't get the opportunity to explain, but we'll see a couple of those as we go through. Okay, here's the first one, LTCP, Local Transport Connectivity Plan. I'll focus on one of those letters, which is the C. That's new. We brought in the idea of connectivity. It's not just about transport for its own sake. It's also about how we connect with people, not just in the sense of an A to B sense, but as we'll all know from our experiences over the last couple of years or so, connectivity has been done in lots of different ways. Digital connectivity is increasingly important for us as an organisation, both as a way of engaging with people and actually getting business done. And it's important for us that connectivity is a strong theme throughout our work. A bit of background on local transport connectivity plan. We already had a local transport plan, but it was quite out of date. We decided we needed a new one. Some of the reasons for this are just reflecting the huge amount of change we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years. Not just the obvious COVID changes, but some of the things that have been going on nationally and internationally. The climate emergency has been a big driver for us. Increasingly now we're looking at social inequality and inclusion, and I think there's a strong feeling that our existing plan wasn't fit for purpose. We needed a new plan. We want everyone to think about how they travel to achieve these outcomes, and for our own purposes we wanted something from which everything else will flow in terms of how we organise and manage transport and the types of schemes and measures that we promote to make it happen. So it's a bit of a new opportunity for all of us. The first part of our plan was approved by our Council's Cabinet this week, so we're off and running now in developing part 2. We've done quite a bit in trying to engage with people in this plan. We've done some early engagement with some of the topics and themes. We've had a good go over our vision, and we've tried to gather as much evidence as we can. And the sorts of examples of evidence I mean in terms of the data we've got on travel by different modes of transport. We've looked at how different demographics move together. We've looked at some non-transport indicators in terms of deprivation or air quality, for example. I think it's fair to say that the granularity of data that we need to make something like this really work still isn't there, and there's a lot more that we need to do. Some of our headline data sets need to be supported by things that are much more locally focused, so we have a much deeper understanding of actually what people are doing, why they're doing it, and what we might need to change. So I think there's still some work to do there. As a result of that work, we came up with a vision. I've popped it up on the board there for you all to read. I think it's just worth drawing out a couple of the words of that vision that are perhaps most important. There's lots in there about inclusivity and tackling inequality. It's a big focus for the County Council now. As many of you will be aware, we had a change in political leadership last year, the year on. We've got an administration that's really hitting its straps in terms of what it wants to do and the reasons why it wants to do it. And as I mentioned before, climate emergency and the need to reduce our carbon is also a huge driver for the plan. So the vision's been carefully formulated and everything comes back to that. To support that vision, we've got some key themes. I'm not going to read all of these again, just leave them up there for you to have a look through. I think one point I would make across all of these half dozen themes is these are things that we're looking to do consistently across Oxfordshire. So we've got responsibility for this transport plan. District councils have got responsibility both for their own local planning framework and collectively they're putting together this Oxfordshire-wide planning document called Oxfordshire Plan 2050, and that's got its own infrastructure strategy supporting that. So there's 3 or 4 really headline documents and pieces of work across Oxfordshire, and they're all using these themes. Some wording very similar, sometimes it's identical, and there's a good reason for that, because we all want to be pointing in the same direction and doing the same things and not having plans that conflict with each other. Targets. This is an interesting one. This is almost like a challenge that we've been set by the County Council. This is the sort of scale of change the Council thinks needs to be made to have any chance of meeting that vision and achieving the outcomes. This is a very significant in terms of the number of reductions, the number of car trips that Oxfordshire's looking at. It's very significant in terms of enhancing road safety, so that, you know, if we can, we reduce fatalities even down to 0 if that can be achieved, and possibly the ultimate target, I guess, by the time we look a bit further down the line. And it is a long-term plan. It's getting to 2050 and actually making a positive difference to the climate and carbon rather than a negative one. That's an enormous challenge for us collectively, but it's an ambition we've been set. And one of the things that we'll need to do through the next stage of this plan is to actually take those numbers and say, okay, what do we actually need to do to stand a chance of meeting any of those targets? We've got some policies that in the plan that then sort of go into some more detail about how we're going to approach each of these areas in order to be able to meet those targets. Most of these that we've been through and developed in previous iterations of our plan, but I think it's fair to say some of them are now getting greater prominence. Road safety I mentioned with our target of Vision 0. Freight logistics is becoming an increasingly challenging area and something that our council wants to look at, see if we can manage that better in a different way, alongside some of the more familiar policies in terms of public transport and so forth. So within the overall plan there's lots of individual areas to look at, but it's how they work together collectively that's going to be most important. So as I mentioned, part 1 of the plan is approved by our Cabinet this week. I think following on from the consultation that we did, it was more extensive than anything that we've done previously for this level of the plan. We were pleased with the overall level of support, sort of around 3/4 of people supporting what we were generally trying to do. Some variation within the different policy areas, the 12 I showed on the previous slide, but the majority of them had very high levels of support. 1 or 2 of them, the percentages were less favourable, and I guess the challenge for us there is, okay, why was that? What were people saying? What do we need to change or adapt as we work through this in detail? And in fact, since the draft document went out to consultation, we went on to refine the plan. We made a number of changes, including, for example, adopting Vision 0 as part of the LTCP framework. Part 2 of the plan work is now underway. Some of this is about looking at more detailed areas, strategies for parts of Oxfordshire. There's a central Oxfordshire travel strategy that I'll be talking about in a minute. There'll be strategies for other parts of Oxfordshire, different areas, rural areas, country towns and so forth. And there'll also be some bus and rail strategy work that we're anxious to do, both to build on our bus service improvement plan that we recently had published, but also to have a look at what we're going to do with rail in what's a very new and very challenging world for public transport, as I think you may have heard previously. As I mentioned, the area strategy has been developed as part of 2. The Central Oxfordshire Travel one is going to be the first of these, partly because our thinking is most developed, partly because there's an urgent need to get on with some stuff, but also I think it will help everywhere else in the county because other things will more easily fall out and build off that. So that's what we're going to be looking at as our first strategy. So, Central Oxfordshire Travel Strategy, what's it all about? Some of you may have heard some of these headline terms, a few more acronyms. Essentially, it's a package of some quite transformative things that we believe is going to be essential to do to actually make a difference. So if you go back to the targets about removing 1 in every 4 car trips on the network by 2030, that's a huge thing. How on earth are we going to do something like that? And it's going to mean the scale of change of what we do and how we do it that we've never seen before. To help us do that and achieve wider objectives on air quality and health and so forth, these are the sort of three main areas we're looking at in terms of core schemes for Oxford and Central Oxfordshire. So the concept of traffic filters, similar to some of the bus gates that we see in operation in Oxford at the moment. We've got a workplace parking levy that we're planning. For any of you who've been to or understand what's happening in Nottingham, that's something that they've done there, where there's a charge levied on workplace parking, and then they get reinvested into the transport networks and effectively built their own tram system off the back of that. And a zero emission zone as well, which is something that will it's started now, it's in place now, it's very small, and it covers a couple of city centre streets. But we'll gradually build and grow out, because it needs to. That's an example of something that needs to move at the right pace, so that you can take people with you to get support for these measures. This all might sound a bit conceptual. That's what it looks like at sort of very headline terms in practice. I think it's important to point out that it's not necessarily going to look exactly like this. There's a specific consultation and engagement exercise we need to do on these proposals, to make sure that people understand them and we can refine them so that what we put on the ground happens in the right place and achieves the right outcomes. But you'll see there on the plan the whole of Oxford City is proposed to be covered by the workplace parking levy. The zero emission zone, which is currently that small purple area in the middle, is supposed to expand to become the green area. And there's half a dozen at the moment traffic filters proposed in and around the city in key places where we think it's not just desirable but essential to change the way that people move around the network. They may not be in those exact locations. It may not be exactly that number, but it's going to be something of that scale and magnitude. And I think one of the things that one of the messages we're going to need to get across to all this is, yes, we need to have some debate about what goes where and when, and listen to and make sure that we understand how it will affect people in real life. But this isn't going to be a cherry-picking exercise, otherwise we're not going to achieve our outcomes. So it's going to be, as I said, something of this scale collectively. Why are we doing it? What are the benefits? What's the point of all this? I've left this slide to the end deliberately because I think that's really what it's important for us to focus on. Post-COVID decline in bus network, and actually the same applies to rail. At the moment, and you may have heard yourself aware, but I think it's a statistic worth repeating, and we had a summit with all our bus partners and stakeholders on Friday that actually went through this in more detail. Bus use is running at about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. That's at an average level. Within that 80%, there were some quite wide variations. So use of public transport, because similar statistics apply to rail as well, is higher at weekends for leisure and for leisure holiday use. It's lower during the week, particularly at peak commuter times. You know, the peak commuter journey has been turned on its head in many ways. So if you looked at, for example, as an indicator of that, if you looked at the levels of park and ride use in the mornings compared to how they were pre-pandemic, that's about 60%. If you looked at levels of public transport use by concessionary pass holders, the people who get transport free based on age, that's running at about 70%. So these are people that are, probably for very good reason, choosing not to use public transport and either not travelling or doing other things, despite the fact they could do so effectively free. So it's creating a huge pressure on the public transport network. 80% sounds like a lot, but that's 20% of people who were using buses and trains before that aren't now. By contrast, travel by car on the Oxfordshire network, on average, is now back up to pre-pandemic levels. It's pretty much at 100%, floating around just 100% is what it was. So we've effectively reached a more or less stable-ish travel pattern, as far as anything's stable these days, that's led to that change. So not only did we have a very hard job looking at where we were in 2018-19 to make the change, we've now got a doubly hard job because things have been going in a different direction as a result of that, as a result of the pandemic. Likewise for pedestrian and cycle flows, again there have been some positive changes in terms of numbers in some areas, but less so in others. So there's a very big job of work to do. And that comes back to some of the previous slides where I was illustrating the point that unless we do something of seismic change, then we're not going to be able to achieve those outcomes. And if we can do it and get it to work in the sort of central Oxfordshire area, that will then have spill-off benefits, because one of the things, and it's a difficult one to get across this, and we often get criticised for having a bit of an Oxford city focus, but there's a reason we kind of start in Oxford, because some of the things that happen elsewhere in the county, particularly in terms of things like bus services and so forth, are very heavily influenced by what happens in the city. So we can get that right and get that level of change and get that to sort of spill out into the networks and places just around Oxford, then it will be a benefit Oxfordshire-wide. But the same principles are going to need to apply to a greater or lesser extent than elsewhere. So what we do in Banbury, what we do in Didcot, we're going to need to change hearts and minds and do the sorts of things that I've illustrated on these slides to make the level of change that I think we're going to need.